Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Spark Spotlight podcast. In today's Mentor Spotlight, I'm speaking with Dr. Candice Lanius about the VUE Lab, which you may remember from last month's podcast. We covered topics like how to make good business decisions based on data and the importance of a professional digital image and online presence. Let's roll. Hi Candice, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you. Do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of some of what you do, your areas of specialty or your professional interests?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an assistant professor of communication arts here at UAH, and my research area really, in a broad sense, looks at how information communication technologies have really changed the ways we communicate and we sort of experience culture amongst ourselves. So that's really the sort of philosophical way of saying it. In practice, that means I do a lot of stuff with technology development and making sure that the things we're making make sense for people. So with Dr. Ryan Weber here at UAH and several other affiliated faculty, I'm a member of the Virtual and User Experience Lab, the VUE Lab on campus. We actually just did a new name, so that's
he was telling
hot
us
take
about that.
Oh, did he already scoop me? He already told you about okay, well. So we're, the new name, the Virtual and User Experience Lab, and we do a couple of projects that we're both personally interested in with eye tracking equipment and other devices such as heart rate monitors to see how people interact with different pieces of tech. And we also have worked with different clients on contracts and grants, evaluating their product or service, making sure it works for their end users. So, and that's also partly why we work here with the I2C to work with different folks on their products and services to make sure that they have checked their assumptions and what they're building makes sense for their end user.
Yeah. That was actually something that I thought of after the podcast with him that I didn't get a chance to ask him is, do you have are you able to share anything about like the types of products that people have like kind of tested out with that? Or is that kind of something you got to keep on the down low?
I'm smirking, and of course you can't see because this is an audio medium rather than visual, but we do have to sign the non-disclosure agreement, so I don't know how much detail it would be appropriate to go into, but
that's fine.
It's a range of things. I'll just say, web-based experiences, making sure that the people that they think will want to use their web-based experiences is in fact who will end up using it, and they've done surveys. We recommend doing walkthroughs and sort of task analyses to make sure that what they're building makes sense. Yeah,
that's fascinating. I think that's such a great resource, and I'm really excited to see how the companies here at the I2C will be able to utilize that research space. And so kind of one of the directions I wanted to go in with this podcast was I think it will be interesting to discuss the ways in which an entrepreneur can kind of look at the business landscape and learn how to navigate it. So since you specialize in areas like argumentation, digital rhetoric, and big data, I think it'll make for a great conversation if we examine the ways that those fields could be used by entrepreneurs to make better decisions about how they conduct their business. So I guess my first question to you is going to be, there's limitless directions that one can use to approach a market as an entrepreneur. And as a result, it can be really difficult to narrow down how you want to tackle it. How can entrepreneurs use big data and research to decide their specific approach to business?
Yeah, these are really important and evolving issues. So whenever I talk about research methods, and in particular big data, I always caution people, big data is the new sexy thing, right? It's big. It's something that we're sort of talking about a lot, but you don't always need to go big. Yep. It really goes back to data quality. So what it is that you're asking, and then making sure that you're mapping the data and your analytical technique to what it is that you're trying to get at. And I always tell people to slow down with some of your initial assumptions and make sure that you're checking those as you go along. So, for example, I'm a devoted cat mom, right? I've got, I won't actually say this is going to be public how many cats I have, but if I was going to develop some sort of new cat furniture, for example, I could just immediately jump in and start designing this cat house with a feeder and a self-cleaning litter box, and and spend hours and hours in design and prototype and build this monstrosity and then try to bring it to market. And then I discover that I am, of course there are other cat ladies out there in the world, but, there might be, many more just regular cat owners who are like, cats are nice, but I don't need to spend $1,000 on your cat motel monstrosity. So, if I was going to be starting that design process properly, I would make sure that, in fact, there is a market for that device. What would be the good price point? Because you're trying to balance value with what it is that you're making.
You want to make something people will actually find worth the money.
Yeah, and so just stopping with the assumption of just because I like cats and very much appreciate my cats doesn't mean that others will be as invested in theirs.
Yeah, it really seems like there's a great art to being able to balance, looking at a market and saying there's a need for this, and recognizing that, what you recognize as, being a gap in the market, somebody else might not. And if that's the consumer base, then, you're kind of missing the mark. You kind of have to really look at things from a perspective that is not just totally design oriented. You've really got to think about, I would want this, but is anybody else going to want this? And that's kind of something that has really been repeated in a lot of the, in the interviews that I've done. Just that it can be really tough to get out of that mindset of, I think this is a good idea, therefore somebody else is going to think it's a good idea too. How do you think that people can really prioritize that mindset? Like, is that something that they can take specific steps to? Like, practically, how does that work out?
Yeah, so I really think it's having a methodology and a thought process where you go into situations and you don't get overly attached to your own ideas. So having a little bit of humility with, I think this might be a good idea, but I'm more invested in the collaboration and working through with both users and other people in the business to make sure that what I'm doing does make sense. And I think the most successful people do have that mindset, and they're sort of able to pivot as necessary to develop whatever it is that they're focused on. Yeah.
I think that's definitely true.
We do have the acronym GOOB, so get out of the building is the the user-centered design methodology, right? So if don't just assume, get out of the building, go talk to people, go see where they're going to be using whatever the widget is that you're developing.
Yeah, that actually really strikes me. It reminds me of, I think, I'm blanking on his name, but it's the person who was responsible for, I guess, a lot of the original Looney Tunes cartoons. And one thing he really emphasized to, just artists in general was that if you spend all of your time looking at art and learning from artists, your art will never be very good. And that really what you have to do is you have to get out and just kind of get in the world and learn from everything, not just your field. And if you can do that, then you're going to be able to make something that really resonates with the people that you want it to resonate with. And then, even then, if you're in a field, like art, where you can surround yourself with all of these different artists, what they're going to resonate with at the end of the day is also the stuff that you can learn from the real world, because, regardless of what field you're in, at the end of the day, everybody does kind of go home to the mundane to some extent. And so what's valuable to them in that setting is really the thing that's most important, whether you're a painter or, a UX designer, graphic designer, anything.
Yeah, absolutely. That context is so important. So getting outside of your own siloed perspective.
Yeah. It's kind of, I guess, related to the idea of, the bubbles that people talk about on social media, and how, being able to kind of get outside of your bubble is often something that's against, maybe what an algorithm on Twitter or something, it's like they are incentivized to show you what you want to see.
Keep you on the platform.
Yeah. And so it really can be hard to be, to remove yourself from that when right now there's so much incentive for, you to stay in those bubbles. And then, I mean, obviously with COVID over the last year, I'm sure it's been harder and harder for people to really get out in the world. In May of last year, it would not have been possible to have something like the VUE Lab because nobody knew whether or not it was safe. We were all pretty sure it was not safe to gather in that capacity. So
yeah, it has been a difficult time period. We have not been cleared to do any human subjects research in the lab just because we don't have. We have a very nice space. I don't mean to besmirch the space, but it doesn't facilitate the 6-foot social distancing rules. So we're actually hoping, I spoke with the IRB chair, the Institutional Review Board chair. They supervise all ethical principles and sort of guidelines for human subjects research. And we should be good to go in the fall. So we're going to start some more eye tracking studies. I'm really excited to get back with eye tracking.
Yeah, that's one of the things that came up in my chat with Dr. Weber that just seems really fascinating. I think that's one that like I mentioned, I'm a video editor, and so coming from kind of like a film background or just having I guess more of just a general interest in it, one thing that analysts talk about is that where the viewer's eye is naturally drawn is hugely important, just to the way something's perceived. And, that's no less true for a website than it is for a film. I think that's really fascinating.
I've had a master's student who did a really interesting eye tracking study. This was pre-COVID, where they were looking at advertisements, and they were sort of saying, what are people focused on in some of these ads? And it was really interesting because the project showed the value of having the eye tracking data, which can surface patterns and behaviors that people might not be conscious they're doing. And then you also can ask qualitative questions to get at, what were they thinking as they were watching these ads? And it was a really self-reflective moment for me because I was, volunteered to be one of the sort of testers for the survey instrument and the eye tracking protocol. So I sat down to watch these advertisements, and when we went back to replay it, I was super focused on a couple of the actors had tattoos, and I was just super checking out the tattoos, not focused on the product, the actual thing that they were selling.
Interesting.
And if you had asked me what did you focus on, I would have been like, their faces or Tide Pods or whatever I don't even remember the product, but no, it was fascinating. I was super checking out their tattoos, and I just wouldn't have known that. So it's one of those things where you can see the value of getting mixed methods and having that triangulation to get at different aspects, because sometimes we don't know. Users self-report that they did one thing when they actually did another thing.
Yeah, that's actually something I haven't thought about. I've been thinking about for the last month or two, really about the ways in which developers might not understand what consumers actually value, but this is the first I've really considered that consumers a lot of times don't really know what they value. Not necessarily anyway. I mean, some things it's, I think more obvious, not to continue to reference back to the chat with Dr. Weber, but one thing that we brought up was Tesla. It's the idea of self-driving cars. That's one example where the consumer really is very self-aware of what they want from a product, but in many other cases, it's I have a brother who works in UX, and in talking with him, one thing he's mentioned is that, as a designer, there are times where you kind of do have to figure out what the consumer actually wants rather than what they would tell you that they want.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I caution students, sometimes you're going to be asking them questions and they've never thought about it before. So if they pause, don't feel like you need to pressure them into answering immediately, because they might have never considered that question.
Yeah.
And that, I think goes back to what your brother told you is, they might not have ever thought about it or considered it or even know. So, rather than saying, okay, what's the first sort of social script that they referred to, So for example, going back to the Tesla cars, I don't think I would enjoy having the self-driving car at all, but I might feel pressured depending on who's asking me to say, yeah, totally, new technology is great. I always love new technology, depending on that dynamic. Whereas if you ask me to like put my money where my mouth is, I'd be like, I'm not spending money on a self-driving car. I like my Honda Civic. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, I think that's definitely, I think one of the biggest challenges that faces is just like, adoption and like comfort with that kind of an idea. And obviously there's many legitimate concerns surrounding that technology.
Yeah, there's another piece of technology I just recently purchased for myself with, we're not, during COVID, you're not able to travel. So that, I'm sure a lot of people bought widgets and get, gizmos to have in their homes. So I bought a smart mug that has its own app on my smartphone. So I can set my beverages to a precise temperature Fahrenheit, and it will keep it at that temperature. And I didn't realize how annoying, because I would pour a cup of coffee and then sit down to read my emails or start course prep or whatever I'm working on that day, and sort of forget about it and then go to pick up the cup of coffee 10 minutes later and it was cold. Yeah. So like this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever bought, but I love it. I absolutely like, so my coffee or tea or whatever it is stays the exact temperature for as long as I want. Yeah. And I do have to remember to turn it off because it won't do that. There's the one thing about the user experience is if it turned off after 2 hours, so I didn't come home to burnt coffee smell in my home office. But and so that would be, I think one of those, the most ridiculous thing I didn't know I wanted until I saw it advertised to me.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
It's been really nice.
Yeah, no, I totally get that too, because especially if you have coffee with cream in it, it gets kind of nasty after a few minutes after it gets cold.
Yeah, you don't want to drink that.
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, so another area that you have specialty in is argumentation. And we talked a little bit before the podcast about this, but, I'm a philosophy student, and I was kind of thinking of argumentation as, this thing that has to do with like formalized logic. But you were saying that the way you actually use it is pretty different than, how I might consider it. And so I was going to ask you, do you think that developing a deeper understanding of argumentation is a worthwhile pursuit for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so the way I'm using argumentation theory is I'm looking at the ways that some of the big data analytical systems are building arguments in practice when they're constructing their system. So one example I always go back to is social network analysis, where they're looking at how can we predict based on the edges and nodes of where people are connected on different social media platforms, how likely they are to actually see those people in the real world or to sort of be influenced by them, right? So if you have one person who is considered an influencer and posts an ad or something, are they actually going to influence the people around them to make a purchase, right? So this can be a really lucrative question, especially, you're spending your marketing budget, you want to do it, with intelligence. So one of the underlying assumptions that is built into a lot of those tools is that the more online interactions you see people having necessarily translates to influence, like actual purchasing influence. And that's not always the case. There are different demographics where that is true, but there are other demographics where, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of hate following or hate watching. Yeah. There are people who will follow a celebrity or a micro-influencer or, do these other types of things, and they're never going to make a purchase on whatever it is that you're looking at. So sort of being able to not just assume, okay, quantity of interactions equals influence equals future purchase, but subdividing that out and saying, okay, where are the different demographics, and there are sort of psychographic features that can help us predict where that's true and then places where it's not true, so that you can be a little bit more nimble with your marketing budget. So essentially that was a long way of saying, sort of looking at the way these systems are built and how they create an argument. So that system argues quantity of interaction equals influence, and so it would be going back and sort of rebalancing that equation. Yeah. If X equals influence if C not influence, look at these other factors so that you build smarter big data systems.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Another way that I was kind of thinking of that is like, is it really that having the data alone is, is that the most important thing, or is the data that you collect really only as good as the analysis of it?
Oh, that's a really actually insightful question, and even sort of you've demonstrated some knowledge here, I think, of the issues with the quantity of data that we are gathering. The false positive rate is so much higher because you can find anything you're looking for if you ask a question that's not grounded in valid research or valid background. So absolutely the analysis technique starts to matter. And rather than sort of going in and we talk about it as p-hacking, which is just running a bunch of statistical tests and, I got 5 out of 1,000, so those must be true. And well, if you actually look at it, there's going to be a false positive error rate. So sort of knowing what you're looking for and sort of being honest with yourself. Okay, here's what I'm looking for. Here's my research question. Here's my analysis. And accepting that you might not have the finding you expected. And so you sort of accept that, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Another thing that I'm curious about is that, do you think that there's a point at which it becomes more critical for somebody to have a human element actually analyzing the data than, setting up a program that can analyze it? Because, if you only have like a certain development budget and perhaps you can't create a robust enough computer system, is that still something that is worth it for entrepreneurs to put that budget into when, it might be the type of thing that they could, a trained eye could also take out of it? Because I know that, data analysis is something that has been around for a lot longer than, like machine learning or AI or anything like that. And it's really something that's totally come in and shaken up the whole game. But, how close do you think it is to really replacing that? Do you think that there's still a necessity for that human element, or do you think it's really basically on the way out?
Oh, I hope not.
Yeah.
I hope that we keep that human element, because that's so important. I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier about siloed perspectives where people, if you don't get out of the building, you don't know what you don't know. And it's the same problem with the analytical technologies. They don't, they're a program. They're designed with certain rules and procedures to follow. So they are never going to iterate upon themselves and change what they're looking at or the way that they're looking at things. So that's where you need the human. Human beings are good at that. We're messy. We're complicated. We have different perspectives. We can change our mind. All of these things are super valuable that sort of go hand in hand with working with the analytical technology. So. Yeah. And as far as, I guess, prioritizing, what you should focus on if you do have limitations with budget, I think talking to real people and having that qualitative data is really valuable initially in the development process. And then as you start to get closer and closer to market, that's when you sort of switch over a little bit more to the more quantitative stuff, because you want to see a magnitude, like, will this work across the marketplace? But before you get there, talking to a couple of people initially is generally a good idea, and it allows you to iterate quickly.
Yeah, I was thinking about the, comparing the human element to the computer. It's almost like, as people, we can move into these spaces, like, the silo, and we can kind of inhabit that area, but we can also move out of it. But the computer is practically the silo itself. It's just, it completely encompasses that space and is extremely thorough in that way, but there's, you can't take the silo out of the silo. I think that's a really fascinating way to think about that problem of, humans are messy, and it's almost like those mistakes that we make that a computer would not allow us to kind of innovate on, existing ideas and figure out, maybe there's a better way to do this. With that discussion, I think that kind of transitions into another one of my questions, which is, in a progressively more digital world, it's only natural that our understanding of the world is also going to become more digital. And as one who specializes in digital rhetoric, what do you think businesses should strive to communicate to their consumer base through their online presence?
Yeah, I think trying to be really authentic to the business's mission and goals, and trying to have a genuine voice that's sort of consistent across communication channels is really important. I know there are some brands that do a really good job, depending on the platform, such as Twitter. I'm thinking of like Doritos or some of these like fun consumer-facing products. Yeah. They have or McDonald's or something, Burger King. They'll get in tweet-offs or Twitter battles, flame wars with each other, and that can be funny and interesting. But I wouldn't encourage other companies who are of a more serious mission or goal to engage in that sort of tit for tat, because it just wouldn't gel with their
We don't
mission.
want I2C starting any Twitter beef.
No, that would be really you guys are like, that College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, where they're they don't know what they're talking about. It would be weird, right? It's just, it doesn't match the tone. And I do know the other thing that's a major issue right now with businesses trying to be socially conscious and responsible, corporate citizens. There's some discussion of how much of that comes across as pandering versus being really authentic and just being a good citizen. So things like pinkwashing. So the pink ribbon campaigns for breast cancer awareness and prevention. The companies slap a pink label on their product on the shelf. Is that perceived by consumers as a genuine effort, or is that seen as pandering to a certain percentage of your clientele? And that conversation goes for everything. So we're in Pride Month. Whether it's celebrating Juneteenth now. These are all active conversations with companies having to make a decision of, where's this line of coming across as authentic and participating without overdoing it so that you're seen as pandering, and there can be a backlash effect there.
Yeah. So would you say that it's really most important before you start thinking about, what your online presence is going to be, to really just take time and make decisions and make sure that you yourself have a really firm understanding of what your business's identity is?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to, I'll talk about the pinkwashing. If you're in a business that is selling a product or service that is targeted towards women, then I think it's a clear business case for, okay, it is important for us to acknowledge and interact with this community on this issue. However, if you are a men's focused brand, and then out of nowhere you're just like suddenly, oh wait, women exist in the world, and it's the month where we slap pink ribbons on everything, that can be jarring and that can be seen. So it really does go back to the business's like mission, like what is it that you do, and is that aligned with whatever this call is? Yeah,
I think in some capacity, especially once your business is past a certain kind of size threshold, it's almost more important to understand like what you are in many ways has become something that people want. It's like, I guess one thing I think of is, brands that have taken their name and their name has replaced the product name, like Kleenex or something like that, where, when somebody is sick, they're like, I'm going to run out and buy some Kleenexes. And you don't really want to maybe dilute your brand by saying, okay, now we're going to branch out into all different sorts of paper products. We're going to start making printer paper. So, it's kind of like understanding that in some cases, what you are established as might become the thing that people want. And then staying true to that can also be important.
Yeah, that's a really apt example. I just sort of cringed at the idea of seeing Kleenex paper, because then I'd be like, I don't want to touch this Kleenex paper because who knows what's on it, right? It's supposed to be a disposable, single-use product, and now you've got printer paper. So that's a really funny example.
I'm almost thinking of the idea of somebody trying to, blow their nose with printer paper. It's hard and stiff, and that just sounds painful.
Yep, not good.
But yeah, anyway, I think that honestly, a lot of the stuff that you've talked about is stuff that, a lot of it may seem pretty like theoretical, but I think that it's at the end of the day, very practical in terms of, you can really adopt this into your mindset as an entrepreneur. And I think it could radically change the way that you're approaching the markets. That, if you've recognized what you think is, some new gap in a market, that you're the one who's going to tackle and fill in, and then your business is going to blow up. If you adopt some of this into your mindset, you really could maybe achieve that in a more effective way, a greater capacity than you might have if you were totally focused on it, as a designer, or if you were not gathering enough data, or if you are not thinking about, how you're analyzing that data. And so, yeah, I think that we've covered a lot of really good stuff. I want to thank you very much for, making time to come on the podcast and educate people a little bit from, your experience, your expertise.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me. And this is a really nice Spark studio over here in the I2C. So you guys have got a great setup, great building, great people. So I'm really excited to see you guys continue here on campus.
Yeah, we're super happy to have you here as a mentor at the I2C. And thanks. Thanks again to Candice for appearing on the podcast. Her insightful points on data and data analysis are just the thing that businesses need to thrive in today's digital world. Once again, I'm also super excited to see the VUE Lab once it's open for use. I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in again. Be on the lookout for the next episode of the Spark Spotlight. In the meantime, check out our socials at UAHI2C on Instagram and Twitter, and UAH Invention to Innovation Center on Facebook. Onward and upward.